every year we have this phenomena that we go deeper and deeper into trying to understand, which is that the Torah portions of Yosef always come out in proximity of Chanukah. This is what you started to mention, either right before, as we have this year, right before and during usually. Vayeshev and Miketz always come out together around the time of Chanukah. And there are different ideas that are expressed. One of them that you just mentioned is very beautiful. And that is that, in fact, it was 2 weeks ago in our podcast when we talked about the patient that was lying in Shaare Zedek Hospital that showed his personal book of Psalms that had been pierced by a piece of shrapnel, and that unbelievable verse, like the snare of the birds has been broken and we escaped. And so in that program, you and I were talking about the difference between a personal miracle and a public miracle. And the fact is that, God has his reckoning, but there is such a thing as a personal miracle. That's, I think, one of the levels of connection between Yosef and Chanukah. And of course, again, in that program, I also spoke about the whole idea about, the fact that the container of oil was first revealed only to a very small group, to the Hashmonai priests, and then they advertised the miracle to everyone. But there is an idea here that's remarkable. One of my favorite and most obscure midrashim teaches us how Yosef is actually demonstrating the concept of appreciating a personal miracle. And so the midrash tells us that on the way back, as Yosef established himself after all the events of the next two Torah portions, Yosef is established in Egypt and in a very, very important position. And then eventually he is taking a trip back to the land of Canaan to bury his father. Mm-hmm. And that's with a whole Egyptian delegation and everything. So there's a midrash that tells us that on that trip back to the land of Canaan, he made a very unusual stop. He stopped by the pit in which he had been thrown by his brothers. And it's so strange. Like, he was like nostalgic. We know that pit was a very, very difficult situation when he was thrown in. Right. In our parsha, the pit, the verse states, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And a very famous teaching of our sages is, why does it have to say both that it was empty and there was no water in it? If it says it was empty, then, and we know how economical Torah is with words, doesn't waste words. So if you tell me that it's empty, why have to repeat that there was no water in it? So the sages say, well, because there was no water in it, but it was full of snakes and scorpions. Yeah. So there was no water in it. So Yosef makes a pit stop, literally, by this pit. And so the sages ask why, and they answer, he went there to recite the special blessing that one recites that an individual recites in a place where a miracle was performed for him. Amen. There's an idea that when a miracle happens for a person, and you go by that spot, there's a blessing to recite, a bracha. So the idea is that Yosef was very, very in touch with what was going on in his life on a deep level, and he understood that Hashem saved him from that pit in order for him to go through all the things that he had to go through to rise to a situation wherein he would be able to provide for his family in Egypt.
I wanted to say that one of these things that he taught Yosef that was pivotal was he talks about the wrestling match. He tells him about the wrestling match and what it meant to him and the revelation that it meant. And so he was laying the groundwork for Yosef to realize completely that everything happens for the good. Every single thing. And he forgot it for a little while when he is thrown into a well and he's sold into slavery. But by the time, you mentioned this, maybe we're going the same place. Go ahead.
No, that's exactly what I was trying to say before. That's why he went back to the pit to make a blessing, because he understood that everything now, because he understood after everything now that everything was really for the good, and that a miracle was wrought for him. And so he almost had like a sweet nostalgic feeling about the pit that was full of snakes and scorpions, because he realized that through that pit he was able to save his family, and he was able to save the world from famine. And so he knew that Hashem was with him in the pit. Mm-hmm. And that was the Psalms 139, Where shall I go from your spirit, and where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heavens, there you are, and if I make my bed in the grave below, you are there. That's how Yosef felt about Hashem being with him, both in the palace of Pharaoh and in the pit full of snakes and scorpions.
Yeah, you could see him staring into that well and saying, "Here I am. I'm the prime minister of the most powerful nation, and Hashem has shown me how to build it into a powerful nation, how to save people from starvation. I've enriched this. I've actually helped build Egypt into a world empire, and it will somehow, if I understand what my father told me, it will facilitate the complete fulfillment of what God told our forefather Abraham at the covenant between the pieces." It all happened. It all began right here. It just with this simple hole in the ground.
There should be like a plaque, like George Washington slept here, kind of thing. Like this is where it all started.
Exactly. Yeah. But then again, it's emblematic of how wells have this heavily symbolic representation in the Torah of changes or implementing covenants.
Right. Except this one again was without water, and we talked about how all the forefathers.
That's pivotal, but it's still a well, which is interesting. And the and just as a sidebar, I have to, for anyone who has not visited Eretz Israel and been out in the outside the city of Jerusalem and been around and done a little hiking, I can't imagine what Yosef went through when it mentioned scorpions. I grew up in South Texas, and we had scorpions that were about this big, and they were brown, and they were painful. You haven't seen a scorpion until you've seen the scorpions in Israel. They're big and ugly.
Thank you.
They're green. They're almost iridescent. I mean, they're frightening looking. They're about this big.
Actually, there's the yellow and the black.
And the black they're even smaller. We saw those at Qumran. Yeah.
I think the yellow are more fatal than the black.
And they're bigger.
Yeah.
They're huge. So they're kind of scary. So this is what Yosef dealt with when he was down there. And the miracle, of course, was that none of them bit them. He wasn't stung or bitten by the snakes.